They watched her children fade, and still no one moved. The wind dragged dust across Main Street, thin and restless, whispering through loose boards and tired doors as Margaret Hale dropped to her knees in the middle of it, her skirts soaking up the dirt, her arms wrapped tight around a boy no heavier than 50 pounds, his skin hot beneath her trembling hands, his breath shallow, uneven, like it might forget how to come back. And she looked up at the people she had known for years, men who once tipped their hats to her husband, women who borrowed sugar from her kitchen, and now they stood behind windows, behind doors, behind silence, their eyes slipping away the moment hers found them, because sickness had a way of turning neighbors into strangers, and fear made people small. "Please," she whispered, though her voice barely carried past her own lips, dry as the cracked earth beneath her knees. "Just a doctor. Just something." But no one answered, and somewhere down the street, a door closed with a hollow thud that sounded louder than it should have, like a decision being made. Her youngest lay on a blanket beside her, too still, too quiet for a child who should have been crying, and Margaret's hand kept reaching back to touch him, again and again, as if to make sure he was still there, still breathing, still hers, and each time her fingers returned, slower, heavier, as if the truth was catching up. The sun climbed higher, sharp and unforgiving, pressing heat into the backs of necks and into the roofs of empty hopes. And that was when the sound came. Slow at first, distant, the steady rhythm of hooves against packed dirt, measured, unhurried, the kind of sound that didn't belong to panic or desperation, but to control, and heads turned, one by one, cautious, curious, until the black horse appeared at the far end of the street, tall and calm beneath a rider who sat straight in the saddle like he had nowhere else to be and no reason to rush, his coat dark, his hat low, his presence enough to pull the air tight around him. Ethan Caldwell. Even the wind seemed to quiet as he rode closer, not fast, not slow, just certain, and Margaret saw him before anyone said his name, saw the way people stepped back without thinking, the way space opened for him like it always did, and something inside her, something worn thin but not yet broken, pushed her forward one last inch, then another, until she was fully in the road, fully in his path, and when his horse stopped just a few feet away, close enough that she could see the dust on his boots and the shadow under his eyes, she lifted her face to him, her voice no longer a whisper but not quite strong either, caught somewhere in between hope and surrender. "Sir, please." The word hung there, fragile, exposed, and for a long second, he said nothing. He just looked at her. Not past her, not through her, at the boy in her arms, at the child on the ground, at the town pretending not to see. And then, finally, his voice came, low, even, carrying just enough to be heard by those who pretended they weren't listening. "What do you have to trade?" The question didn't sound cruel. That was the worst part. It sounded normal, like this was how things worked, like this was a balance to be settled. Margaret's breath caught, and for a moment, her hands tightened around her son as if she might refuse, as if pride still had a place here. But then the boy shifted, just slightly, a weak movement that felt like a countdown, and something inside her gave way without a sound. She reached slowly into the pocket sewn inside her dress, fingers brushing against the edges of a small wooden box worn smooth with years, a box she hadn't opened since the day her husband placed it in her hands and told her to keep it safe, always safe. And when she pulled it out, the sunlight caught on its scratched surface, revealing nothing of what it held, only the weight of what it meant, and she lifted it toward him with both hands, like an offering, like a memory she could no longer afford to keep. Margaret's hands did not shake when she held the box out, but her breath did, shallow and uneven, like she was already bracing for it to be taken and dismissed in the same motion, like everything else had been that morning. And Ethan Caldwell did not reach for it right away. He just looked at it, then at her, then at the boy in her arms, and something unreadable passed behind his eyes before he finally leaned forward in the saddle and took the box with one hand, turning it slightly as if weighing more than just wood, more than just whatever might be inside. And for a moment, the entire street seemed to lean with him, waiting, hoping for something different, something softer, but he said nothing, not a word of reassurance. Not a promise, not even a refusal. He simply closed his fingers around it, straightened in his saddle, and with a small motion of his heel, urged his horse to turn, and just like that, he was leaving, the sound of hooves pulling away, steady, controlled, the same way he had arrived, as if nothing had happened, as if a woman had not just handed over the last piece of her life in exchange for a chance she could not even see yet. And Margaret stayed there in the road, still kneeling, still holding her child, watching his back grow smaller with each step, her mind trying to catch up with what had just happened, trying to understand if she had been helped or simply emptied. And behind her, a murmur began to rise, low and uncertain, the kind of sound people make when they want to speak but do not want to be heard. He took it. Someone whispered. Of course he did. Another voice said, quieter, almost relieved to be right, and no one stepped forward. No one offered anything new, because in their minds, the story had already ended the way it always did. The powerful taking, the desperate losing, and the sun kept climbing, pressing heat into Margaret's shoulders, into the small body in her arms, and she lowered her head just enough to press her cheek against her son's forehead, closing her eyes for a second that felt too long, too final, until a faint sound pulled her back, not from the street, but from behind the tall wooden gates of Caldwell's ranch, a sharp call, a command, followed by the sudden burst of movement, boots on gravel, voices raised not in panic but in purpose, and then another sound, one that did not belong to quiet ranch mornings, the creak of heavy wheels being moved, harnesses pulled tight, horses shifting under new weight, and Margaret lifted her head slowly, her eyes finding the closed gates, her breath catching again, but this time for a different reason, because something was happening on the other side, something fast, something deliberate, and the people along the street felt it too, their murmurs fading as they turned, as they listened, as they waited, unsure whether to step closer or step back, because Ethan Caldwell did not move like other men. He did not waste motion, and he did not act without reason, and whatever he had decided in that quiet moment when he took the box, it had not ended when he turned his horse away. The gates did not open right away, and that was what made people lean closer, what pulled them from doorways and shaded porches into the open sun, because waiting felt heavier than leaving, and Margaret stayed where she was, still in the road, still holding her son, her knees numb now, her thoughts drifting between hope and the quiet kind of resignation that settles when a person has run out of places to knock. And then the first wagon rolled into view behind the slats of the gate, its wheels thick with dust from roads far longer than the one that led into town, and a second wagon followed, then a third, each one lined with crates marked in dark ink, each one pulled by horses that did not belong to this valley, taller, stronger, the kind used for distance, not for show, and the murmurs shifted again, lower now, uncertain, because this was not a single act, not a passing decision. This was something prepared, something planned beyond the moment in the road. And when the gates finally swung open, slow and deliberate, the wagons did not rush out. They moved steady, controlled, guided by men who did not look around for approval, who did not pause to explain. They simply followed the path down Main Street as if it had always been theirs. And behind them rode Ethan Caldwell, no longer alone, his posture unchanged, his expression just as unreadable. But now the space around him felt different, filled with motion, with intent, and Margaret pushed herself up slightly, not standing, not yet, but enough to see over the heads that had gathered, enough to watch as the first wagon stopped not at the general store, not at the sheriff's office, but directly in front of her, the driver pulling the reins with a practiced hand, the horses settling into stillness as if they had reached exactly where they were meant to be. And for a moment, no one moved, not Margaret, not the crowd, not even the men on the wagons, until one of them climbed down, boots hitting the ground with a solid weight, and began opening the crates without ceremony, without announcement, the wood lids coming off to reveal glass bottles, cloth-wrapped bundles, sealed tins, things that caught the light in a way that spoke of purpose rather than display. And the smell changed, faint at first, then clearer, clean, sharp, something unfamiliar to a street that had only known dust and heat for weeks. And Margaret felt her breath hitch again, not from fear this time, but from something she had not allowed herself to feel since the morning began, and she looked up at Ethan, searching his face for a signal, for a word, anything that would explain why this was happening here, why now. and he met her gaze for just a second, long enough for her to see that same unreadable stillness. And then he looked past her, to the rest of the town, to the people who had watched and waited and said nothing, and his voice carried just enough to reach them all, calm, measured, leaving no space for argument. "Start here," he said. And it was not a request, not a suggestion, it was an order that settled over the street like a line drawn in the dust. And the man beside the wagon nodded once and stepped toward Margaret, not hesitating, not asking permission, already reaching for what he needed, while the crowd stood frozen, caught between disbelief and the slow realization that whatever they thought they understood about Ethan Caldwell had just been proven wrong. The man did not ask Margaret for permission. He simply knelt beside her with steady hands that carried no panic, no hesitation, only purpose. And for the first time that day, someone touched her child without fear, without pulling back, as if sickness was not something to be avoided, but something to be faced. And Margaret watched every movement, her breath held tight in her chest as the man checked the boy's pulse, his temperature, speaking low to another behind him who was already opening a case lined with clean cloth and glass vials that caught the sunlight like something rare, something distant from this place. And the second man moved quickly, measuring, preparing, his actions practiced, precise, while the crowd stood frozen, their earlier whispers gone, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than any noise, because now they were not just watching a woman beg, they were watching something change, something they had not expected to witness. And Margaret's youngest stirred on the blanket, just slightly, a weak shift that made her heart lurch, and the man beside her turned immediately, adjusting the cloth beneath the child's head, his voice calm, steady. "He needs water first," he said, not to her, but to the air, as if the answer had always been there, and a canteen appeared in his hand. Cool, metal, offered without question, without price, and Margaret hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes flicking past him to where Ethan Caldwell still sat on his horse, watching, not intervening, not explaining, just there, a silent weight behind everything unfolding. And then she took the canteen, her hands no longer shaking the same way, lifting it carefully, guiding a few drops to her child's lips, watching, waiting, counting every second as if time itself had slowed to match the rhythm of his breathing. And when he swallowed, barely, just enough to matter, a sound escaped her throat that was not quite a sob, not quite relief, something in between, something fragile and dangerous, because hope, once it returned, demanded more. And behind her, another crate opened, then another, the steady rhythm of wood and iron, of tools being laid out, of work beginning, and more men stepped down from the wagons, moving with the same quiet efficiency, not looking to the townspeople, not asking who deserved help and who did not. They simply followed the order that had been given, and the line that had not existed before began to form, hesitant at first, a man stepping forward, then stopping, unsure, a woman pulling her child closer, then glancing around as if waiting for permission that never came. And still Ethan said nothing. He did not call them forward. He did not promise anything. He only remained where he was, watching, as if the choice now belonged to them. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the first person moved closer, then another, drawn not by words but by what they were seeing with their own eyes. And Margaret realized that whatever she had given up in that small wooden box, whatever piece of her past now rested in Ethan Caldwell's hand, had not been taken for nothing. Because this was not a single act, not a moment of mercy. This was something larger, something that reached beyond her children, into the very heart of a town that had forgotten what it meant to stand together. And as the man beside her worked, as the sun climbed higher and the street filled not with silence, but with movement, Margaret lifted her eyes once more to Ethan, searching not for answers now, but for understanding. And for just a second, he looked back at her, and in that brief, quiet exchange, something unspoken passed between them, something that made it clear. This was only the beginning. The line did not form all at once. It grew slowly, like something the town had forgotten how to do. One step, then another, people moving closer with hesitation still clinging to their shoulders, but curiosity pulling harder now. And the men from the wagons did not rush them, did not call them out or turn them away. They simply worked, hands steady, voices low, treating each person the same, whether they came forward quickly or stood there for a full minute before taking that first step. And Margaret stayed where she was. Her world narrowed to the small movements in her son's face, the slight easing of his breathing, the faint color returning where there had been none, and each change felt too fragile to trust, like it might vanish if she looked away for even a second. And yet around her, the street was changing, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, because people who had stood behind doors were now standing in the open, watching, waiting and, slowly, beginning to believe that this was real, that help had come without being asked twice, without a price spoken out loud. And a man near the back of the forming line shifted his hat in his hands, his voice rough as he spoke, not to anyone in particular. What is he expecting in return? And no one answered him, because that question hung heavier than any of the others, heavier even than fear, and Margaret heard it too. The doubt that refused to leave, because kindness without a cost was something this place did not recognize. And she lifted her eyes again to Ethan Caldwell, still on his horse, still silent, as if the answer might be written somewhere in the way he held himself. But there was nothing there to read, no sign of demand, no sign of debt, just the same stillness, the same distance. And yet he had not left, he had not ridden away after giving the order. He remained, watching as the work unfolded, as if making sure it did, as if this mattered beyond a single moment. And then something else shifted, something quieter, almost missed if not for the way the nearest man paused in his task and glanced toward the general store, where the owner stood in the doorway, arms crossed, face tight, calculating. And for a second, the old way of things tried to push back in, tried to reassert itself, because if medicine was being given here, for free, then everything built on scarcity began to lose its grip. And the store owner stepped forward, his voice sharp enough to cut through the low hum of movement. "You cannot just hand things out like this," he said, not loud, but firm, aimed directly at the man working beside Margaret. And the man did not even look up, did not pause. He simply continued, as if the words had not reached him. And that, more than anything, unsettled the street, because ignoring a challenge was not how things were done here. And the store owner took another step, his jaw tightening, ready to speak again, to push harder, until Ethan Caldwell moved, just slightly, a shift in the saddle, a turn of his head, and that was enough. The man in the doorway stopped, the words he had been about to say never leaving his mouth, because whatever authority he thought he held did not stretch far enough to challenge what was happening now. And the silence that followed was different from before, not empty, not fearful, but full of something new, something uncertain but steady, like the first sign of rain after a long dry season. And Margaret felt it without needing to name it, because in her arms, her child breathed easier, and for the first time since the morning began, she allowed herself to think a thought she had been too afraid to touch, that maybe, just maybe, this was not something that would be taken away. The street did not return to what it had been, not after that moment, because once people stepped forward, once they crossed that invisible line between watching and acting, something inside them shifted in a way that could not be undone. And the line grew longer now, not hesitant anymore, but steady, forming with a quiet rhythm as more hands reached out, more voices spoke, softer than before, but no longer silent. And the men from the wagons moved among them with the same calm precision, measuring, pouring, binding, their work flowing from one person to the next like it had been rehearsed long before this day ever arrived. And Margaret felt it in the way the air changed, in the way the heat no longer pressed down as heavily as it had an hour ago, because now there was motion, there was purpose, and purpose had a way of pushing back against despair, even if only a little, even if only for a moment. And her son stirred again, this time stronger, a faint sound escaping his lips. That made her lean closer, her heart tightening not with fear, but with something sharper, something almost painful in its suddenness. And she brushed her fingers across his forehead, feeling the heat begin to ease, not gone, not yet, but different. And that difference was enough to make her breathe again, slow, careful, as if afraid the moment might break if she moved too quickly. And beside her, the man working nodded once, not looking at her, not needing to, as if he already knew what she was feeling without needing to hear it. And behind them, a child laughed, a small, unexpected sound that cut through the low hum of the street. And heads turned, startled, because laughter had not belonged here for days, maybe longer, and it spread something unseen through the crowd, not loud, not overwhelming, but present, like a spark catching in dry grass. And still, Ethan Caldwell did not move. He remained where he was, watching not just the people, but the space between them, the way they stood closer now, the way they no longer avoided each other's eyes. And that was when Margaret noticed something she had not seen before, not clearly, not until now. The men on the wagons were not just handing out supplies. They were marking things, small notes written, names asked quietly, details gathered not for payment, not for debt, but for something else, something that stretched beyond this single day. And she followed one of the men with her eyes as he moved down the line, speaking low, writing quickly, and then moving on, and it struck her slowly, like a realization that had been waiting just out of reach. This was not just relief, not just a single act of help. This was a system, a structure being laid down where nothing had existed before. And she looked again to Ethan, and this time, she saw it differently, not as a man who had arrived to give, but as a man who had arrived to change something that had been broken long before she ever stepped into that road. And the thought settled heavy and quiet in her chest, because whatever she had given him in that small wooden box, it had not simply been traded for medicine. It had set something in motion that this town did not yet understand. And as the sun dipped just slightly, casting longer shadows across the street, the work did not slow. It continued, steady, deliberate, as if there was no question that it would. And Margaret realized, with a certainty that surprised even her, that this day was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something none of them had seen coming. The afternoon stretched longer than anyone expected, not because the sun refused to move, but because time itself seemed to slow under the weight of what was happening. And the town that had once hidden behind doors now stood in the open, watching as order replaced fear one careful step at a time. And Margaret shifted her position slightly, her legs aching from the hours spent on the ground. But she did not move away, not even when someone offered to help her stand, because leaving this place, even by a few feet, felt like stepping away from something she could not risk losing. And her son's breathing had settled into a steadier rhythm now, not strong, not yet, but no longer fragile in the same way. And each small breath felt like a quiet promise being kept, one she had not believed in when the morning began. And the men from the wagons continued their work without pause, rotating positions, exchanging tools, speaking in low tones that carried certainty rather than urgency. And Margaret noticed how they never wasted motion, never repeated a step unnecessarily, as if every action had been decided long before they ever reached this town. And that thought lingered with her, because it meant this had not been a sudden decision, not a passing act of kindness sparked by a moment of pity. This had been prepared, arranged, built piece by piece somewhere far from this dusty road. And she followed that thought until it led her back to Ethan Caldwell, still mounted, still watching, his presence now less like a stranger's intrusion and more like something that had always belonged here, though no one had noticed it before. And a man further down the line spoke up, louder this time, his voice carrying a mix of confusion and something else, something close to disbelief. Why would he do all this? And the question did not meet resistance. It spread instead, passed from one person to another in quieter tones, because now that the fear had loosened its grip, curiosity had taken its place. And Margaret heard it all without turning her head, her focus still on the small movements in her son's chest. But the question settled in her as well, deeper than the others, because she was the one who had stood in front of him, the one who had given him the only thing she had left. And she still did not understand what he had seen in that moment, what had made him act in a way that defied everything the town believed about him. And as if pulled by that thought, her eyes lifted again, finding him where he remained. And this time, she saw something different, not in his posture, not in his expression, but in the way he looked at the people now, not with distance, not with indifference, but with a quiet attention that suggested he was measuring something beyond their immediate need. Something that reached further than this day, further than this line of waiting hands. And then, without warning, he dismounted, the motion simple, controlled, boots meeting the ground with a soft thud that still managed to draw every eye in the street. because until now, he had remained apart, elevated, removed, and stepping down changed that, brought him into the same space as everyone else, and for a brief moment, the work around him slowed, not stopping, but shifting, as if the presence of the man who had set it all in motion carried a weight that could not be ignored, and he walked forward, not toward the center of the line, not toward the wagons, but directly toward Margaret, each step steady, unhurried, and the closer he came, the quieter the street became, until even the wind seemed to hold its breath, and Margaret felt it before she fully understood it, the sense that whatever came next would change everything again. He stopped just a few feet from her, close enough that the dust on his boots matched the dust on her dress, close enough that for the first time, he did not look like a distant figure on horseback but a man standing in the same heat, breathing the same air, and Margaret did not rise. She did not try to meet him halfway, because something in the moment told her this was not about pride anymore, and Ethan Caldwell did not ask her to stand. He did not offer a hand. He simply looked down at her son, his gaze steady, measuring, as if confirming something only he understood, and then, without a word, he reached into his coat and pulled out the small wooden box she had given him, holding it for a second before lowering it back into her hands. The motion simple, deliberate, and Margaret froze, her fingers closing around it instinctively, her breath catching as if she had been given something she no longer believed she would see again, and she looked up at him, confusion rising faster than relief, because this was not how trades worked, not here, not anywhere she had known, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them while the town watched, waiting for meaning to catch up with what they had just seen, and when Ethan finally spoke, his voice was low, calm, carrying just enough to reach her and no one else. "It was never payment," he said, and the words settled slowly, like dust, after a long ride, and Margaret felt them before she understood them, felt the weight of something shifting inside her chest, something she had held tight all morning finally loosening its grip, and she looked down at the box in her hands, then back at him, searching his face for something more, some explanation that would make sense of all of this. But he did not give one. He only held her gaze for a second longer before turning slightly, his attention moving past her to the rest of the street, to the people who had gathered, who had watched, who had begun to step forward, and this time, when he spoke, his voice carried further, not raised, not forced, but firm enough that it reached the edges of the crowd. "No one pays for this," he said, and the statement landed differently than anything before it, because it was not a promise, not a gesture, it was a decision, one that left no room for negotiation. And the reaction rippled through the people like a quiet shock, disbelief first. Then something softer, something uncertain but growing, and Margaret felt it too, not as a thought, but as a release, something inside her finally giving way to the reality in front of her, and she clutched the box a little tighter, not because she needed to keep it safe, but because she needed to feel it there, needed to know this was real, that she had not imagined the moment when everything had begun to change, and Ethan stepped back then, not turning away completely, not leaving, just creating space again, allowing the work to continue without him standing at its center, and the men from the wagons did not pause, did not acknowledge the exchange, they simply kept moving, as if this had always been the plan, as if the return of the box was just another step in something larger, and Margaret watched him for a moment longer, trying to understand what kind of man gave back what he could have kept, what kind of man built something like this without asking for anything in return, and the answer did not come, not yet, but the question stayed with her, steady and quiet, because whatever this was, it was not finished. The words did not fade when he stepped back, they stayed in the air, settling into the cracks of the street, into the spaces between people who had spent too long believing that everything came with a cost, and for a while, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to question, only something to accept, slowly, carefully, like stepping onto ground that might still give way beneath their feet. And Margaret felt it more than she understood it, the way the tension that had held her together all morning finally loosened, not all at once, but enough for her shoulders to lower, enough for her breath to come easier, and she looked down at the wooden box again, turning it slightly in her hands, as if expecting it to feel different now, heavier or lighter, changed in some way. But it was the same, worn, familiar, holding memories she had not been ready to lose, and now did not have to. And that realization settled deeper than anything else, because what had been given back to her was not just the box, but the part of herself she had almost surrendered along with it. And beside her, the man continued his work, adjusting the cloth beneath her son, checking his temperature again, nodding once more as if confirming the progress without needing to say it aloud. And Margaret followed his movements with a quiet focus, her fear now replaced by something steadier, something that did not rush but held its ground. And around them, the line moved faster, not because people were being pushed, but because they no longer hesitated, no longer stood at a distance waiting to see what would happen. They stepped forward with a kind of quiet trust that had not existed before, and the men from the wagons adapted without pause, shifting their rhythm to meet the growing need, their work expanding outward, reaching further down the street. And someone began organizing the line, not one of Ethan's men, but one of the townspeople, a woman who had stood back earlier now stepping in, guiding others, speaking softly, creating order where there had been none, and it spread from there. Another man offering to carry water, another helping someone sit. Small actions building on each other until the street no longer felt like a place of waiting, but a place of doing. And Ethan Caldwell watched it all without stepping back in. His role already set in motion, his presence no longer commanding the scene but anchoring it. And Margaret saw it clearly now, the difference between someone who gives once and someone who changes what giving looks like entirely. And she realized that whatever he had started here was not meant to end when the wagons were empty. It was meant to continue, carried by the very people who had once turned away. And the thoughts settled into her slowly, almost quietly, as she looked around at faces that had changed in the span of a single afternoon, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to matter. And then her son shifted again, stronger this time, his eyes fluttering open just a fraction, enough for her to see that he was there, truly there. And her breath caught in her chest as she leaned closer, whispering his name without realizing it. And he did not answer, not yet, but he did not fade either, and that was enough, more than enough. And Margaret closed her eyes for a brief second, holding that moment in place, knowing without needing to say it that whatever had brought them to this point had changed more than just one life. By late afternoon, the light began to soften, stretching long shadows across the street that no longer looked like the same place it had been that morning, and the wagons still stood open, their contents steadily decreasing, but not in a frantic way, not in the desperate rush Margaret had expected. Instead, there was a rhythm now, a flow that moved from one person to the next with quiet certainty. And the townspeople had fully stepped into it, no longer waiting for direction, no longer holding back. They carried water, they held children, they spoke to one another in voices that had found their way back after being lost to fear. And Margaret sat among them, no longer in the center of attention, but no longer invisible either, her presence woven into the movement of the street. And her son rested against her, his breathing deeper now, his small hand gripping the edge of her dress with a strength that had not been there before. And she kept one hand on his back, feeling the rise and fall, steady, real, something she could trust. And every now and then she would glance toward Ethan Caldwell, still standing a short distance away, not apart, not above, but no longer directing either, as if he had already done what he came to do, and the rest belonged to the town itself. And that thought stayed with her, growing clearer the longer she watched, because nothing here felt temporary anymore. Nothing felt like it would vanish when the wagons were gone. It felt like something had been set in place, something that would remain, carried forward by the very people who had once turned away. And a man approached her then, one she recognized but had not spoken to in months, his hat held low in his hands, his eyes not quite meeting hers at first. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried something unfamiliar, something softer than she remembered. "I should have helped this morning," he said, not loudly, not for others to hear, just for her. And Margaret looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a quiet understanding that surprised even herself, because the truth was, she had been ready to give up on all of them, ready to believe that no one would step forward. And now here they were, stepping forward in ways that mattered. And she gave a small nod, not forgiving, not condemning, just acknowledging what had been said. And the man seemed to understand. his shoulders easing slightly before he turned and moved back into the flow of work. And Margaret watched him go, realizing that this too was part of what had changed, not just the help being given, but the way people were beginning to see themselves in it. And as the sun dipped lower, the heat easing into something more bearable, the streets settled into a quieter pace, not stopping, but no longer urgent, as if the worst had passed and what remained could be handled. And Ethan finally moved again, not toward the wagons, not toward the crowd, but toward his horse, his steps as steady as ever. And for a moment, Margaret thought he might leave without another word, without looking back, the way he had earlier. But just before he reached the saddle, he paused, his gaze sweeping once across the street, taking in the people, the movement, the change that had taken root in a matter of hours. And then he mounted, the motion smooth, familiar, and without calling attention to himself, without asking for thanks, he turned his horse toward the open road and began to ride away, leaving behind not silence, but something far more lasting, something that did not need him to stay in order to continue. And Margaret watched him go, the wooden box still in her hands, her child breathing steady against her shoulder. And for the first time, she understood that what had been given that day was not just help, but something the town had not known it needed until it arrived, and something it would not forget once it was gone. The sound of his horse faded slowly, not rushed, not chased by voices or calls, just a steady rhythm moving farther down the road until it became part of the distance itself. And yet no one turned away when he left. No one returned to their doors or closed themselves off again, because something had already taken hold, something that did not ride away with him. And Margaret felt it in the way the street continued to move, not because it was told to, but because it had learned how. And she adjusted her son gently in her arms, feeling the weight of him not as something fragile anymore, but as something present, something staying. And the wooden box rested against her lap, untouched now, no longer a bargaining piece, no longer something to be given away, but something returned with a meaning she had not expected. And as the last of the sunlight stretched across the buildings, the men from the wagons began to shift their work. Not packing up, not leaving, but organizing what remained, setting aside supplies, marking names once more, speaking quietly with those who had stepped forward earlier. And Margaret noticed how they spoke differently now, not just treating, but instructing, showing people what to do, how to care for one another when they were gone. And that realization settled into her slowly. This had never been about staying. It had been about leaving something behind that could stand on its own. And a woman approached her then, one she barely knew, carrying a small bundle of clean cloth and a container of water, her hands steady as she knelt beside Margaret without hesitation, offering them without a word. And Margaret accepted, their eyes meeting for a brief second, something unspoken passing between them, not gratitude alone, but recognition. And as the woman moved on to the next person, Margaret found herself watching her, seeing not a stranger anymore, but someone part of the same quiet effort that now filled the street. And nearby, the general store owner stood again in his doorway, but he did not step forward this time. He did not speak, his posture no longer rigid, his expression less certain, as if the ground beneath his place in this town had shifted without him noticing. And that too was part of it. The way things that had once seemed fixed were now being questioned without a single argument needing to be made. And Margaret looked around, taking in the faces, the movement, the change that had come without warning and without permission. And she realized that this moment, this afternoon, would not be forgotten when the dust settled. It would stay, carried in the way people looked at each other tomorrow, in the way they chose to act when no one was watching. And her son stirred again, stronger this time, his fingers tightening slightly against her dress, and she smiled without thinking, a small, quiet expression that felt unfamiliar after so many hours of fear. And she pressed her hand gently against his back, grounding herself in the simple truth of his breathing. And as the light began to fade into evening, the wagons remained, the work continued, and the town, for the first time in a long while, did not feel like a place waiting for something to happen. It felt like a place that had already begun. The night did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like a blanket drawn over a town that no longer feared the dark the same way it had that morning. And lanterns began to glow along the street, soft and steady, not as symbols of isolation behind closed doors, but as markers of a place still awake, still working, still holding on to what had been started before the sun went down, and Margaret remained where she was. Though someone had brought her a chair, though others had offered to carry her child inside, she stayed near the wagons, near the quiet center of it all, because something told her that leaving too soon would feel like stepping away from a story she needed to see through. And her son slept now, truly slept, his breathing even, his small body no longer tense, and she found herself watching him not with fear, but with a careful kind of wonder, as if she was relearning something she thought had been taken from her forever. And every now and then, she would glance at the wooden box resting beside her, its surface catching the flicker of lantern light, reminding her of the moment everything shifted, and she still did not fully understand it. Not the man, not the choice, not the reason behind it all, but she understood the result, and sometimes that was enough. And around her, the town moved in a way it had not in years. People spoke in quieter tones, not out of fear, but out of respect for the moment, for the work still being done, and the men from the wagons had begun showing others how to continue, how to measure, how to prepare, how to care, their voices patient, their movements slowing just enough to teach instead of simply act. And Margaret noticed how quickly some of the townspeople learned, how naturally they stepped into roles they had not held before, as if the ability had always been there, waiting for a reason to surface. And that thought stayed with her, growing stronger as the hours passed. Because this was no longer about what had been brought into the town, it was about what had been uncovered within it. And near the edge of the street, the general store owner stepped forward again, not with resistance this time, not with complaint, but with something quieter, something uncertain. And he spoke to one of the men from the wagons, his voice lower than before, his posture changed, and Margaret could not hear the words, but she saw the exchange, the nod that followed, the shift that came after, and it told her more than any explanation could, because even the ones who had held on the tightest were beginning to let go, and as the night deepened, the work did not stop, but it no longer felt urgent. It felt steady, sustained, like something that would carry into tomorrow without needing to be forced. And Margaret wrapped her arm more securely around her child, feeling the warmth of him, the weight of him, the simple truth of him being there. And she let out a breath she had not realized she had been holding all day, a slow, quiet release that seemed to carry everything with it. The fear, the doubt, the desperation that had brought her to her knees in the dust. And in its place, there was something else, something she did not try to name, because naming it might make it fragile, might make it something that could be lost. And instead, she simply sat there, in the glow of lantern light, in the middle of a town that had changed in ways no one had expected, holding on to the only proof she needed, that sometimes the moment you think everything is about to end is the moment something else begins. By the time the last lantern burned low, the town had grown quiet in a way that felt earned, not empty, and the wagons stood lighter now, their crates half-filled, their tools laid out in careful order, ready for hands that would return in the morning. And Margaret had not moved far, only enough to rest her back against the wooden post beside her, her son sleeping against her shoulder with a steadiness that no longer needed to be checked every few seconds. And when she finally looked up at the sky, she realized she had not done that all day, had not allowed herself the space to see beyond the ground in front of her. And now the stars were there, clear and steady, like they had been waiting, and she let that sight settle into her, slow and quiet, as if it belonged to this moment as much as anything else. And around her, people moved less, spoke less, but they did not disappear. They stayed, some sitting nearby, some resting against walls, some simply watching over the others. And it felt different from the morning, different from every day before it, because no one was alone in it anymore. And Margaret's hand rested lightly on the wooden box beside her, her fingers tracing the worn edge without thinking. And after a moment, she opened it, not out of urgency, not out of need, but because she could. And inside, the contents were just as she remembered, untouched, unchanged. And yet it felt different now, not because it had been taken and returned, but because of what had happened in between. And she closed it again, gently, as if sealing something new inside it, something that had not been there before. And across the street, the general store owner stepped out once more, not with hesitation this time, but with quiet intent, carrying a small crate from his own store, setting it down near the others without announcement, without drawing attention to himself, and then stepping back, as if unsure where he fit now, and no one questioned it, no one challenged it. They simply made space, and Margaret watched that moment carefully, because it told her something she would not forget. That change did not come from being forced, it came from being shown. And once it was seen clearly enough, it could not be unseen. And as the night settled deeper, the last of the work slowed to a stop, not because it was finished, but because it no longer needed to continue into the dark, and one by one, people found places to rest, to sit, to stay close, and Margaret shifted her son slightly, adjusting him so he would sleep more comfortably, and he stirred just enough to press closer to her, his small hand finding hers without waking, and she held it there, her fingers wrapping around his with a quiet certainty that had returned in place of the fear that had once filled her. And somewhere far beyond the edge of town, a faint echo of hooves might have still carried through the night. Or maybe it was only memory, but it did not matter, because what had been set in motion did not depend on that sound returning. It lived here now, in the way people had chosen to act when they could have done nothing, in the way a single moment had opened something larger than itself. And Margaret closed her eyes for a brief second, not to rest, but to hold that understanding in place. And when she opened them again, she did not look down, she did not look at the ground that had once held her in desperation. She looked forward, into a town that had changed without raising its voice, into a future that no longer felt empty, and she realized, without needing to say it out loud, that sometimes the greatest thing a person can give is not what they leave behind, but what they awaken in others. And out here, under a sky that had seen it all, that was enough.